Today we're going to look at the tool options for the rectangle, ellipse and the free select tools in Gimp 2.10. Now first I'll show you them individually, and then I'll create a little clip art train as an example of how you can use them in combination with each other. Now this video is designed for absolute Gimp beginners, so if you've got any Gimp experience you may find it very slow and boring, so be forewarned. Now before I start, I'm going to reset my tool options back to their default settings. And to do that, I go to the bottom of my tool options panel and find the button that says Reset to Default Values, Shift Reset All Tool Options. I hold down my Shift key and click on that button, and then I click on Reset. Now I'm going to work on a new blank canvas, so I click on File in the menu bar and click on New. And I'll accept the default settings and click on OK. Now the first tool we're going to look at is the rectangle select tool. So I go to my toolbox and click on the rectangle select tool to select it, and then come down to my tool options panel, which is below the toolbox. Now each tool has its own set of options, and the first set of options for the rectangle select tool are the modes. Now the modes determine how your selections interact with each other, and by default the mode is Replace the Current Selection, and I'll show you how that works. I'll drag out a selection on my canvas, and now I'll drag out a second selection. And you see that the first selection disappeared. It was replaced with my second selection. So I'll go back to the tool options and we'll look at the second mode option. Now this mode option is Add to the Current Selection. So I'll click on it to select it. And now I'll drag out another rectangle. And you'll see there that the selection I already had on my canvas remained. In the Add to the Current Selection mode, I can create multiple selections and then edit them all at the same time. I can also create new shapes by overlapping my selections. Now you'll notice that when you create a selection, the adjustment areas inside it remain live until you create another selection. Now if they're a nuisance, you can get rid of them simply by clicking inside your latest selection. And now to show you how you can edit them all at the same time, I will colour them with my foreground colour. And the easiest way to do that is to use the Control and comma keys on my keyboard. And I'll deselect them by clicking on Select and None. And all of the selections deselect at the same time. And now I'll press the Delete key on my keyboard to clear that canvas. Now going back down to the tool options, the next mode is the Subtract from the Current Selection mode. To use it though, you first need to make an active selection in either of the first two selection modes, either the Replace the Current Selection mode or the Add to the Current Selection mode. Now as I'm still in the Add to the Current Selection mode, I'll create a selection using that mode. Now let's say I want to remove the top right corner of this selection. I then go back to my tool options and click on the Subtract from the Current Selection, and then create a rectangle covering that top right corner. And now the marching ants tell you that Gimp has removed that area from my original selection. And to make it more obvious, I'll fill it with my foreground colour using my Control and comma keys and deselect it. So now I'll clear that canvas with the delete key on my keyboard. And the next mode is the intersect with the current selection mode. This mode creates a selection from the area which the original and new selections have in common. So once again, I need to be in one of my first two modes to create the first selection. So I'll go over and click on Replace the current selection mode to select that and drag out a selection. And now I'll go back to the Tool Options panel and click on the Intersect with the current selection mode to select that. And I'll drag out a second selection, which overlaps the first. And you'll see there that the marching ends are telling you that the only area that has remained active and selected is this small area here. That's the area that the two rectangles had in common. And I'll fill it with my foreground colour to show you and deselect it. So that was the modes. Again, I'll press the delete key on my keyboard to clear the canvas and go back down to my Tool Options panel. Now I'll reset my modes back to the default mode, which was the replace to the current selection. Now the first option under the modes is anti-aliasing. Now anti-aliasing helps to take the jagged edges off your selection. By default it should be checked, and I always leave mine checked. Now under the anti-aliasing is the feather edges mode. Now feathering the edges fades the edges into the background, and you can alter the depth of the fade by altering the radius. So I'll click in the box to put a check in it, and I'll increase the radius so it's more obvious. Now I'll drag out a rectangle on my canvas and fill it with my foreground colour, and then deselect it. And you'll see that the edges have all gone soft and fuzzy, and they've sort of faded into the background. That's the feathering. So I'll come back down and uncheck feather edges. Now the next option is rounded corners. So I'll click in that box to check it, and again I'll increase the radius. And I'll drag out another rectangle. Again, I'll fill it with my foreground colour and deselect it. Now I can make the corners rounder or sharper by increasing and decreasing that radius. So I'll come back down and click in the rounded corners box again to uncheck it. And I'll clear the canvas by pressing the delete key on my keyboard. Now the next option is expand from centre. With this option you can create a selection around a specific point on your canvas or image. And to show you one way to use it, I'll open a photo in a new project. So first I'll open the photo by clicking on File and Open. The photo's on my desktop, so I'll click on Desktop. And this is it here, the beast for Gimp, so I'll double click on it. Now what if I'd like a new photo of this catamaran with the catamaran in the centre of the photo? All I have to do is click on Expand from the centre. Then I place my cursor where I want the centre of the photo to be, hold down my mouse button and drag out my selection. And now I have a selection with the catamaran in the centre of it. And now to crop that selection, all I would have to do is click on Image in the menu bar and come down and click on Crop to Selection and then deselect it. And from this, if I wanted to keep it, I would export it as a new JPEG. However, this was just an example. I don't really want to keep it, so I'll close that project and go back to the blank canvas. And now I'll come across and uncheck Expand from the center. Now with the next group of options, you can restrict the size or shape of your rectangle selection. By default, it's on fixed aspect ratio 1:1. Now 1:1 is a square. So if I click in the box to check it and drag out a rectangle selection on my canvas, it will always be square. However, if you click on the drop down arrow beside the fixed aspect ratio, you'll see that you've got several other options. You could restrict the width, the height, or the size. So I'll click in that box again to uncheck it, and I'll deselect my square. Now because my screen isn't quite big enough, I can't see all of the options. I need to either drag down the slider or use my mouse roller to see them. So I'm going to drag down my slider. Now the next two options are the position and size. The position tells you where your selection is on the canvas, and the size tells you the size of the selection. In this instance, they're giving me the size and position of a rectangle that I've deleted. Now under those options is the highlight option, and I'll click on that to check it and drag out a rectangle to show you. Now everything that isn't selected has got a mask over it, and this can be really useful if you're selecting on really busy images. Now the mask does not show up in your final image, it's just a guide in the project. So I'll deselect that, and I'll click in the box to uncheck it. Now under that are the guides, and by default no guides are selected. But if you click on the drop down arrow, you'll see that there are quite a few guides available. Probably one of the most popular would be the rule of thirds. So I'll click on that to select it. Now the guides allow you to put temporary guidelines on your selection, and these can help you to line up your selection to a specific area on your canvas or image, and they're often used in photo editing. Now I've clicked on the rule of thirds, so I'll drag out a rectangle selection on my canvas, and you'll see that Gimp has put in guidelines using the rule of thirds. These are temporary guidelines and they do not show up in your final image. So I'll deselect them. And we can look at the last two options, auto shrink and shrink merged. Now I don't know what these do. On my version of Gimp they don't seem to do anything, but if you know what they are or what they do, please let me know in the comments. So that was the rectangle select tool. Now we'll have a quick look at the ellipse select tool. So I go back to the toolbox and click on the ellipse select tool to select it, and then come down to my tool options. Now at this point I can't see the first options because my slider's still at the bottom, so I'll drag it back up, and now I can see the first options again. Now the ellipse select tool has got the same modes as the rectangle tool, and again by default the mode is replace the current selection, and it has virtually all the same other options. The only difference now is instead of creating rectangular selections, you're creating round selections. So the rounded corners option's gone, and the fixed aspect ratio 1:1 is now a perfect circle. And now we'll look at the free select tool. So I go to the toolbox and click on the Free Select tool. And if you come down to the tool options, you will notice that you have the same modes as the other two, and again the default mode is the Replace the Current Selection mode, but you only have anti-lacing and feather edges in the general options. Now the thing to remember with the Free Select tool is it does not activate automatically. You have to activate it, and I'll show you what I mean. I'll create a selection, remembering that I'm in the Replace the Current Selection mode, and now I'll create another, and I can't. The reason I can't is because my first selection isn't active yet. I need to activate it. And to do that, I can click on another tool in the toolbox, double click inside the selection, or press the Enter key on my keyboard. And I'm going to press the Enter key on my keyboard. And you'll see it became activated. The ants are now running around the outside of it. And now I can create another selection. And again, it's not activated yet, so it can't replace the first selection. And I'll activate it by pressing the Enter key on my keyboard. Now that's the same with the Free Select tool, no matter what mode you're in. So I'll change the mode to the Add to the Current Selection mode and create another selection. And again, nothing happens until I activate it. So that was a look at the rectangle, ellipse and Free Select tools and their options. But I use them all individually. You can use them in combination, and I'll show you a very quick example of that. First, I'll deselect this selection. Here I'm going to create a simple clip art train. Now before I start, I'm going to reset my tool options back to their default settings. So I go to the bottom of my tool options panel, find the button that says Reset to Default Values, hold down my Shift key and click on the button. And then I click on Reset. Now the first tool I'm going to use is the Rectangle Select tool. So I go to the toolbox and click on it to select it. Then I come down to the tool options and click on the Add to the Current Selection mode to select that mode. And now I'm going to drag out a rectangle for the body of the train. Next, I'll drag out a second rectangle for the cab. Now you'll notice that in my current or last selected area, the adjustment areas are still active. And if I change my tool options while these adjustment areas are active, that may alter this current rectangle selection. So to deactivate them, all I have to do is click in the center of the last selection. And you'll see they've gone now. And now I'm going to go to my tool options panel and click in the box for the rounded corners to put a check in it. And I'll increase the radius a bit and drag out another rectangle. And again, I'm going to click in the center of that last selection to deactivate the adjustment areas. Now I'd like to put a window in the cab of the train. So I go back to the tool options, and this time I click on the Subtract from the Current Selection mode. Now I don't want it to have rounded corners, so I click in the Rounded Corners box to uncheck it. And I drag out a rectangle where I'd like the window to be. And now I'll create the wheels. And to do that, I'll go back to the toolbox and click on the Ellipse Select tool to select it. And I need to come back to the tool options again and click on the mode for Add to Current Selection. Then I'm going to come down and click in the box for expand from center, and then click in the box for fixed aspect ratio. I want to restrict the size of my ellipses, and I want them to be perfect circles. So I come along and click on the drop down arrow and go down and click on size. And I'm going to change the size from 100 by 100 pixels to 200 by 200 pixels. And then I'll drag out my first wheel near the front of the train and my second one just behind it. Now I'm going to create the back wheel, and I'd like that to be a little bigger. So I go back to the size and increase the size to 250 by 250. And I go towards the back of the train and drag out another wheel. And now I'll create a little coupling using the free select tool. So I go to the toolbox and click on the free select tool to select it. And again, I want to change the mode. So I come down to the tool options and click on the add to the current selection mode. And I'll click out a little coupling shape at the back of the train. Now, because this is the free select tool, it does not automatically activate itself. I need to activate the selection. And to do that, I'm going to press the Enter key on my keyboard. And finally, I'll add a little scoop for the front of the train. So again, using the free select tool, I'll click around a little scoop shape. Now once again, because it's the free select tool, I need to activate it. So I'll press the Enter key on my keyboard again. Now that's the outline of my train. And next I'm going to fill it with my foreground colour by using the Control and comma keys on my keyboard. And finally I'll deselect it by clicking on Select and None. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how simple it is to use these tools in combination with each other. But don't forget, as always, if you've got any problems or suggestions, please don't hesitate to leave a comment.